Well, good evening and welcome to The Journey Home. I'm Marcus Grodi, your host for this program. Once again, EWTN gives us this opportunity to relax and listen to the work of the Holy Spirit in someone's life. And our guest tonight is more to the journey than just Episcopalian, but he's listing him as a former Episcopal priest, Andrew Petiprin. And Andrew, it is a great privilege to have you on the program. Let me just tell the audience a little bit more, because you have a website called andrewpetiprin.com, but you're a fellow of popular culture at the Word on Fire Institute. Maybe before we join your journey, tell them what that is.
Sure. Well, thanks, Marcus, for having me. The Word on Fire Institute is one of the newer initiatives coming from Bishop Robert Barron's Word on Fire Catholic Ministries. And it's just a great privilege for me that I was invited to be a part of the team kind of in the building phase of this great endeavor, where we're offering courses and creating content and resources for the church. So it's a great honor that I was invited into this ministry so early, really, in my time as a Catholic.
Well, I was going to say that not only being on this program, but having that job is something you probably never expected a while back.
Not at all. It's really a dream come true.
All right. Well, let's get started on your journey, if you will.
Sure. Well, my journey begins with infant baptism in my grandparents' home at the hand of a Presbyterian minister, a retired one at that. But I give thanks for the grace that I received there in the earliest days of my life. That was not nothing. In fact, it was hugely important. And from that point on, my family. My experience in my family was very Jesus-loving, Bible-reading, hymn singing. My mother had been raised Southern Baptist and then became an Episcopalian. My father was a Presbyterian, and so they raised me and my sisters mostly in Methodist churches. So that was kind of one of those great American compromises within Protestantism. But it was very life-giving. It was very positive. There was not much negative that I can remember from those times. It was all very positive, and especially our home religion was positive. My mother took very seriously the role that she played to pray with us, to teach us to pray, to instill in us a deep faith and love for Jesus. And our relationship then with the church was, with churches, I guess, was a little bit funny, because although we were always involved in youth groups and choirs and all that sort of thing, there was a strong sense in which what really mattered was that direct relationship with Jesus and sort of the practice of faith within the life of our family. So I remember, for example, one Easter going to our Methodist church. We went to Sunday school first, and we saw that the church was packed. It was Easter Sunday. And so my mother just decided, well, let's just go home then. We didn't actually stay for worship, even though it was Easter Sunday, because, for us, religion was not bound up in just worshiping in the building.
Andrew, as you look back, it really is amazing how, and I did too, that in the Protestant world, just the idea that only thing that really counts is faith in Christ. It doesn't matter what church you go to. It's amazing how we just so assume that.
Right. We do, and I certainly assumed that growing up, and so that's why it didn't matter which church we attended, and eventually we ended up going several years later. Sadly, after my parents divorced, we started going to a non-denominational megachurch type thing. This would have been the early 90s, where this was sort of really getting up and running. And, again, it didn't really matter. The community was great. It was strong. It was actually very good for broken families. They had a lot of programs for children, for youth, and all of that sort of thing. And that, too, was fine. It was life-giving. It was all very positive. I don't have memories of it, of feeling like I was a part of a judgmental community or anything like that. But the other important piece was that my mother was an English teacher. And so along with the scripture and the prayers and the singing and all of that, there was this deep infusion of kind of a literary imagination. And that, I think, more than anything else just about, was one of those major markers for me on the road into the church. Because when you're reading C.S. Lewis, The Chronicles of Narnia, when you're reading Tolkien, when you're reading sort of the other great works of literature, you just can't help but kind of imagine a deeper reality that is on offer. And so, I grew up in that world.
Did she have you do the King Jimmy? Bible.
We did, not only though, but yes, we did. But I'll tell you, we did memorize a lot of scripture.
Yeah.
And we recited that portion of Ephesians 6, put on the whole armor of God every single morning in the car on the way to school. So I was, saturated in scripture and story and kind of literary imagination from the earliest time.
Okay. All right. I don't think you mentioned, but maybe did the separation of your parents have a big impact on you and your faith as well as you?
It did. It did on me and everyone in our family. It really shook our faith for all of us. And like I said, we moved to a different city and we started going to this non-denominational church. Yeah. And it was right when I was coming into my teenage years and feeling kind of rebellious anyway. And with this break with my parents, that naturally led to lots of questioning of who to trust and what kind of authority I could depend upon. And I found that as my teenage years progressed and I was in the non-denominational church, I felt like I could trust the leadership less and less at the church where we belonged. And it wasn't anything, it wasn't anything nefarious or anything like that. It was just this growing sense in me that it can't just be this guy with his Bible. It can't just be this building in this community, And so, when I started my undergraduate years in college, I was deeply fascinated with all the questions of faith, but I didn't go to church. I wasn't sure where I belonged, but I wanted to belong. I had this deep longing. And so I kind of lived this solitary life where I read C.S. Lewis, I read things like Thomas à Kempis' Imitation of Christ. I read St. Augustine. I mean, things that were so deeply Catholic, but I didn't know quite yet.
Yeah, that's very common. It really is. It's amazing how common that is. But he was still here?
Very much so. Yeah, and kind of burning more and more. And in fact, it was during this time, interestingly, Marcus, where I think it was my sophomore year of college, my roommate and I had this old TV, and we lived in a university apartment, and they gave us this basic cable package, and one of the channels we got was EWTN. And I remember waking up, I've always been an early riser, and I would wake up, nobody else would be around or doing anything, and I would sit there on the couch and watch Mass on EWTN almost every morning.
Wow.
And I would just think, I didn't know what to think of it. I mean, it's not that I had never heard of Mass before or knew something about what Catholics did, but watching that on my screen coming into my own life was really beginning to stir something in me and do something in me that only later I came to realize the meaning of.
Some Methodist churches can have a higher liturgy.
We did. At least one of them that I went to growing up, we did have a kind of a higher liturgy.
Yeah.
And so when I became an Anglican later, certainly a lot of the hymns that we sang, a lot of pieces of liturgy were very, very familiar to me from those early days. So I'm grateful for that.
That's what I was envisioning as you're watching the Mass in EWTN. There'd be some parallels, many similarities or scripture, but in the format. But at this point, at your experience in college, you're watching EWTN and Mass in the morning, but you weren't going to church anywhere.
Wasn't going to church, no. But then it was the summer of 2001, and I had won a scholarship to get to study at Oxford University in England, which was just an incredible dream come true. A lot was stirring in my soul at this time. I think finishing college, sort of wondering where I was going with my life, and then 9/11 happened. And that was right before I was supposed to get on an airplane and move to England. And, that affected all of us. Of course it did, but especially me. I was 21 years old. I was about to move to a foreign country. I knew the Lord was stirring in my heart. Something was happening. And so when the airports reopened, I got on a plane and went to England, showed up at my college at Oxford. And the first person I met was the college chaplain, an Anglican chaplain. And, I don't know whether it was just trying to process what had happened in 9/11 or like all of these things, but he invited me to come along to this quiet celebration of the Eucharist every morning. And I did. I started going. And then every night I would come back and listen to choral evensong. And before I knew it, I was living this rhythm of life that, although it wasn't the fullness of the Catholic faith that I now am so overjoyed to be a part of, it was a very important kind of antechamber to what was to come.
Our guest is Andrew Petiprin. Andrew, when I think back on my time visiting England and Scotland, I wish I could have gone more often. Mm-hmm. But I get a sense in as well as watching British television, which I tend to do more often than I probably should. But that this idea of a rhythm that you were talking about, Mass, seems to be more a part of English culture anyway. I don't know if you noticed that. And maybe it's because so much a part of it is their church,
Yes.
whether they realize it or not, or practicing or not. But this rhythm that connects them with a much longer history seems to be more common in England than we experience here in the States.
I think that's right. I mean, England is so secular now, so a lot of people have kind of dropped out of that rhythm. But the strange thing was, at least when I was there from 2001 to 2004, is that it was going on whether anybody was kind of doing it or not. It was just always going. And so, you're studying in one of the great universities on the planet Earth, and every few hundred yards down the high street and in all of these other corners of this town, there's this beautiful chapel that has these wonderful services going on all the time. And so many people were oblivious to it and didn't ever bother to darken the door. But boy, I did. I thought, I was thinking about, again, like my literary imagination, I was thinking about T.S. Eliot, pray where prayer has been valid. And I thought to myself, like, thank you, Lord, for like delivering me to this place where prayer has been valid. And it wasn't only valid, in my opinion, because of, my love for Eliot and that line, but amazingly, the Lord drew me to Magdalen College, Oxford. That was my college at Oxford, which was C.S. Lewis's college. So the idea that I was praying where prayer had been valid, I would think to myself, C.S. Lewis prayed right there. So for me, that was just hugely important.
Chris, did you lift a pint over where he used to?
I did, yeah. The bird and baby, as they say, among other places. But my time in Oxford was so formative spiritually in all of those ways.
So during that time, did you make the official jump to Anglicanism?
I did. I was confirmed in the Church of England in 2002 and immediately began talking to my chaplain about the prospect of ordination as an Anglican. And it was one of those things I was almost embarrassed to bring up because I thought, well, I've only been an Anglican for about 5 minutes and, and all of that. But he was so kind and so, so generous with me in talking about that and really helped me understand that there was, that what I was going through was stuff that I had always been going through, the kinds of questions, the stirrings in my heart that had been happening for a long time. So I began to think more in that direction. I finished my master's degree at Oxford, but decided not to go on to doctoral studies because I was just obsessed with church stuff and I just wanted to explore that. So I moved to England. I moved to London from Oxford for 1 year and worked as a lay worker, a lay assistant in an Anglican church to kind of think some more about a possible vocation within the Church of England. And then ended up coming back to the United States after that 1 year. And all sorts of things started happening from there. One most important thing is I reconnected with my wife. I knew her from years before, and we reconnected, and we were married really within a year. So that was a kind of a short courtship. But I also continued to process whether I was called to ordain ministry. But another big thing that happened during this time was John Paul II died. And I know a lot of people have mentioned this on your show, Marcus, but it was that event, watching on television, watching the church do what it does when John Paul II died and Pope Benedict was elected was absolutely mesmerizing to me. And I was stopped dead in my tracks thinking to myself, am I in the right place? Am I in the right church? And it was also important because, in England, because you're going to these college chapels and all these sorts of things, it's easier to kind of like believe that you're in the right place to some degree because it's sort of what there is.
Well, they're made out of stone, so they got to be right.
Right. I mean, there were days when I didn't even realize there was a Roman Catholic church in Oxford, which is absurd, of course. But when back in the States, everything becomes so denominationalized and fragmented and all of that sort of thing. And so instead of being a part of the Church of England, I was being a part of the Episcopal Church, just a kind of actually pretty tiny denomination in the large landscape. So I did stop at that time and think hard about what I was supposed to do and prayed.
Well, when you're walking around Oxford, you said, well, that's where C.S. Lewis prayed. Did it ever cross your mind, well, that's where Newman prayed?
Should have. It should have. But I didn't know who John Henry Newman was at that time, believe it or not.
Wow, interesting.
And funnily enough, when I did learn who John Henry Newman was, when I finally did decide to go ahead towards ordination in the Episcopal Church, and I went to divinity school, and I read Newman, and I loved him, and I loved the whole Oxford movement and the Tractarians and all of these guys. At least where I was studying, we really stopped at 1845 with John Henry Newman. And we really were kind of taught, it wasn't so much beaten over the head, but it was sort of implied that what had happened to Newman in 1845 was kind of a tragedy. And that was sort of what we learned, that if he had only kind of given himself a little more to the idea of Anglicanism, kind of to the theory that you could take a Protestant denomination and sort of Catholicize it, then he would have been better off, and so would we all. So it took me several years before I got back around to actually reading post-1845
I'd
Newman.
never crossed my mind that Anglicans treat Newman the way we treat Tertullian.
Some do. I would say yes, especially in the crowd that I was running with. There was some degree of sadness about Newman.
Yeah. So you like we remember Tertullian's early stuff,
right?
But we ignore the rest.
Right. I mean, what a great preacher Newman was. This great evangelical preacher who stood up in this way. Yeah, there was a sense of the tragedy of it.
Okay. When I don't want to take you back a little bit, but as you're studying Anglicanism in England and then that, were you satisfied with the church that you were coming into, even before the John Paul II awakening? Were you satisfied with what you were being taught?
I was because like so many Protestants who make their way to the Catholic Church eventually by way of Anglicanism, it did seem to me like Anglicanism was a very sensible place for me to go, because it wasn't submitting to the Pope. It wasn't that huge leap out of what I had known. It felt like a much more natural progression towards just a kind of more formal, a more serious, even a more historically rooted expression. So I didn't have a problem with it. And I have to say as well that at that time I was probably a little more progressive on certain ideas and that sort of thing. And so, to me, I also didn't mind the idea that Anglicans were kind of a little more progressive on some of its moral teachings, or if they had any moral teachings, depending on which church you were in and that sort of thing. So none of that really bothered me at the time.
Okay.
But it started to.
But the death of John Paul.
That was a big piece of it for me. Yes.
Okay. All right.
Yeah. So John Paul II died. But I decided anyway to go on to divinity school and study for holy orders in the Episcopal Church, and I was ordained a deacon and a priest in the Episcopal Church in 2010, and immediately started parish ministry. I served briefly.
And you're married, and your wife
married.
is solid Episcopalian with you?
My wife became Episcopalian as well.
Okay.
She was baptized in the Anglican Church, and also became an Episcopalian.
Right. And
so we were both Episcopalian. We had no children at this time, and we moved out to Arizona, where I was an assistant at an Episcopal parish for about 14 months. Our son was born out there, and then immediately we ended up back in Florida, where we come from originally, and I was given charge of a congregation that I led for about 6.5 years. And that was an extraordinary experience for a whole lot of different reasons. For one reason, I was kind of back in my hometown. I was ministering to people who had even known my parents and all sorts of things like that. And so I was really like building a precious community. And I'm so grateful for the opportunity that I had and the experiences that I had there. But I was nagged the whole time about whether I belonged in the Episcopal Church or whether I was called to the Catholic Church.
Oh.
And here, I like to make a distinction, and I like to do it with this metaphor. I'm a runner, and so I'm always thinking of running and setting new distance goals and time goals and all that sort of thing. Yeah. So for me, thinking of my journey towards the Catholic Church has always been running towards. It's like St. Paul says to the Corinthians, like, I don't run aimlessly. Yeah. Yeah. And so for me, although I was distressed by a lot of things that were happening in the Episcopal Church as far as changes in teaching and changes in practice and moral, things, it was never that I wanted to, well, let me put it this way. There were times when I felt like I just wanted to run away from it. but I knew that those weren't the real moments when I was being serious and open-hearted to what the Lord was really calling me to do. Because what he was really calling me to do was run towards the fullness of faith in the Catholic Church. And so those years were very important to me to kind of process that and think about that. Now, during that time...
I was going to also ask, were you becoming less progressive in your thinking?
I was, yes. And I had actually, before that, when I was at divinity school and sort of saw the landscape, I kind of came to my senses about some of that. I thought to myself, I never really thought those things. I mean, I really am kind of a more traditional guy, but I was just going with the flow and that kind of thing. But yeah, I sort of became more traditional minded, more conservative in certain ways. And, getting married and starting a family kind of does that to you anyway, to some degree. But yeah, so I was increasingly becoming a kind of group within a group, because I was like sort of a part of this more Catholic minded and more conservative minded group within the larger Episcopal Church. And so, it was beginning to feel like a pretty lonely place to be. But as you know, when you're ministering to a congregation, you're pretty busy, and it's easy to push some of that stuff down because, well, I've got to go do this funeral, and all of that.
Because it ain't about you.
Because it's not about you.
It's about those folk and being a channel of Christ's grace.
Right, and thank God it was, because I think that by the time we finally made the decision to come into the fullness of communion with the Catholic Church, we understood that even that decision to do that was not about us.
Yeah.
So, but I was ministering to these people and always looking for resources to share and looking for, what am I supposed to be teaching them? And so I went in different directions at different times. But one thing I ended up settling on was Bishop Robert Barron's Catholicism series came out around the time that I was really getting into this ministry with these people in Orlando. And so I used it. I used the Catholicism series with my people, and they absolutely loved it. And then I used it again. And then I used some other teaching series from Word on Fire and other Catholic resources. If people asked me questions, I would open the Catechism of the Catholic Church because I knew there were answers in there.
Were these Episcopalians of the ilk that one day they'll be Catholic, or, well, we're already Catholic?
A bit of both. But the thing that I discovered on the ground as an Episcopal priest was that the theory of Anglicanism is much more in the minds of the clergy than the people in the pews. Most of the people, even the people who are Catholic-minded and who do have a certain kind of ecumenical hope maybe, typically are still there because they've chosen that denomination.
Okay.
And they know that they're there because it's not the Catholic Church and it's not the Baptist Church. Sure. Now, it's not everyone by any means. But I began to think about this probably around the year 2015. I began to think, if I left, would my people come with me? Like maybe we could come together into the ordinariate or something like that. And the truth was, the more I searched my heart and thought that through, the more I thought, some might, but I don't think most of them would. Yeah. And I think it's because they're here for a reason, and and I'm here to serve them. So at this time, it was really providential that I was invited to come and join the staff of the Episcopal Bishop of Tennessee. So I left my parish, and it was a sad farewell because I loved these people so much, and my children were growing up there and were loving it there. But it was the most wonderful thing that ever happened, that I was able to kind of get out of parish ministry, because it was then that I was really able to clear my head and open myself up more to what the Lord was really calling me to do. And so 2 years later, we were able to come into full communion with the Catholic Church.
Was your wife in lockstep with you in the journey?
I don't know if I would say in lockstep, but it's something that we had talked about many times over the years. And so when it finally happened that I came home from a conversation. I joined this ecumenical reading group in Nashville where I had gone to work for the Bishop of Tennessee. And these two incredible Dominican nuns were, Nashville Dominicans, were in this group. And just listening to them talk and hearing them personally express the Catholic Church's kind of official welcome and recognition of gifts that someone like me had, I came home to my wife and I said, I think we're getting real close to the time now.
What about your vocation?
Well, that was a struggle. That was something where I had to really process that in prayer. But I became very sure of one thing, which was whatever happened with that, we were supposed to be Catholic. Yep. and that the first thing that was most important was for me and my family to come into the Catholic Church and for us to begin to live as Catholics. And as it stands now, I mean, the door is open to those things maybe somewhere in the future, but it's not where I am right now. I'm really delighted to be serving the church, writing and teaching, working at Word on Fire, and just trying to learn how to be a good Catholic husband and dad.
I can't tell you how many times in our work with particularly Episcopalians and Anglicans, clergy that have come to us and are considering the Catholic Church, that often the first questions they ask is, well, how do I become a priest? And the staff here have to kind of sit with them and say, you have to keep these two issues are separate issues. Because the church and your vocation are separate issues. They're separate issues. And you can't, you got to be willing. Because the issue is, where's God calling you?
It's true.
That's the issue.
And you have to realize that whatever ministry you had, even if you were wearing a black shirt and a collar every day, the Catholic priesthood is very different.
Yeah.
It really is a very different thing. And so it really is important for guys who are coming over to pause and realize that. And it may well be that it's still a green light and they're still called to sacramental ministry, to reordination in the Catholic Church. But it's really important to remember that it is different.
Well, one thing that you subtly illustrated, if you will, is that as an Anglican priest, you served in Arizona and then Florida,
right,
and then Tennessee.
Correct.
That is an incarnation.
That's right. That's right. You're much less your own when you're a Catholic priest, and that's why celibacy is rightly the discipline of the Church. I mean, I'm in awe of these guys, of these celibate priests. I see what they do, and I just want to be a buttress to their fortress. I just want to find ways to support them, at least at this stage in my life.
Yeah, I have right in front of me this holy card from my son Peter, who was ordained a priest 2 weeks ago.
Oh, congratulations!
And what was interesting is that we were waiting on the day of his ordination, because it wasn't until he was ordained that we were going to find out where he's going to go.
Wow. Yes. Yeah.
That's incarnation.
That's right.
Because a part of his ordination ceremony was laying flat on the cathedral floor in front of the bishop.
Yes. And there is some combination of being called and being sent in Anglicanism, but I mean, it is still ultimately a job with a paycheck and a pension at the end, and quite a bit of freedom to decide where you want to live and what kind of congregation you want to serve and that sort of thing. And I didn't have any problem with that at the time, but I have to say, even though I'm not pursuing the path to ordination right now, my desire to kind of really be a missionary and go where the Lord called was something that was very attractive to me about becoming a Catholic.
Well, it's too bad you want to be a missionary. It's too bad that the United States isn't a mission field.
Oh my goodness.
We'll leave it at that. Take a break. Well, maybe we'll come back to that very issue when we come back in a moment. So before we take a break, I want to remind you of AndrewPetiprin.com is Andrew's website, but I also want to remind you of chnetwork.org. That's our website. If you can check on that, you can find out more stories like Andrew's. We'll be back in just a moment with more of Andrew's story. Welcome back to The Journey Home. I'm your host, Marcus Grodi, and our guest is Andrew Petiprin. I ended the first part of our program with this issue of missionary in this, whether it's a mission field in the United States or not, and we're going to let's get to that, because I want to talk more about specifically the work you're doing. But I want to go back a little bit and ask you, the two questions are, what now that we've got you into the church, you and your wife and your family into the church and your story, I'd like to take a step back and talk about what were the kind of the main things that brought you into the church specifically, and then also what were the biggest barriers for you to get over to become Catholic. So maybe the main things that brought you into the church, if you will.
Well, I mentioned this discussion group that I was in that included these two Dominican nuns, and their prayers for me, their discussions with me, our conversations together were very, very important in just, for one thing, understanding what the church thought about me and my family. that we weren't strangers, that we weren't nothing, that all of those celebrations of the Eucharist that I had done as an Anglican weren't black masses. It wasn't poison, and so that sense of like that I had a lot right, but there was a fullness that awaited was suddenly very attractive to me. At the same time, I was working on a book called Truth Matters: Knowing God and Yourself that I started for my congregation back in Orlando. I started writing this book because I thought, what are the things that I want to teach them? And so I became enamored with this idea of like creedal Christianity, that there was this thing sort of like mere Christianity or something. There was this sort of way to be a Christian that wasn't necessarily being a Catholic, but it was more or less getting everything you needed. And so I started writing this book that was designed for people of all different denominations and traditions and that sort of thing. But as I neared the end of writing this book, this question of truth and where it was to be found weighed on me more and more heavily. And this is actually when I came to read post-1845 John Henry Newman and read his essay on the development of Christian doctrine in particular, which was, and my book is nothing like that masterpiece, but that book was for him a similar issue. It was, writing himself into the quandary of, well, now I know where I have to be. And so finishing this book for me was a really big test, and ultimately made us decide that it was time to go.
I remember reading, and I don't know if I mentioned this on the journey home recently, but it was one of the readings of Liturgy of the Hours. But I think it was Cyril of Jerusalem, in his catechetical instructions, at some point says, a lot of you may someday learn to read, but until then, and you can't read the scriptures, that's why the church, in her love for you, has summarized the essentials into this creed.
Right.
I mean, the beautiful purpose of that that unites us.
Well, and it just occurred to me that creed isn't something that can be detached from the church. It isn't a tool to be used to, in all kinds of different circumstances. I mean, of course, it can bind people together from different traditions and that sort of thing, but it is an expression of the church's faith, and it belongs to the church. And so for me, it felt like, well, I need to be there. I need to be in there. I need to belong to the church too.
Yeah. It'd be like, we can be critical of sola scriptura. We can also be critical of creed, sola crede.
Sure.
Apart from anything, we just have this creed that we hold on to. What would you say were the biggest barriers?
I would say at the end, the barriers were almost entirely practical. There weren't really any theological objections or anything like that. There wasn't sort of one doctrine I had to get straight in my mind, or that my wife or whatever that we as a family had to sort out together. It was almost entirely practical. And the way that it played out was really tough for us. I was making good money in my position on the staff of the Episcopal Diocese of Tennessee. I had a great pension ahead of me that would await me at the end of 30 years of service, which is now gone. And I was a homeowner. I had all of these sort of middle-class American concerns that I had to figure out. But the date was set for us to leave, and we did. And I began 6 months of unemployment, which was really tough. And it's one of those things where, in retrospect, you ask yourself, well, if I knew it was going to be 6 months of unemployment, would we have done it then? Would we have done it like that? I hope that I would say yes, but it was a really tough time. But, the Lord was faithful, as he always is. And, I hope if any of your viewers are worried about some of those practical things, I really do think that my story resulted in one of the tougher situations compared to a lot of other people that I've encountered, as far as just the practical side of things. But the Lord is faithful, and if you obey him, he will be faithful. And that certainly was the case with me and my family.
Did you feel supported by the church after your entry?
Very supported by the church, overwhelmingly so. As far as spiritually, with encouragement and all of that sort of thing. And we were supported by family and friends. I mean, people put $1,000 checks in our hands out of nowhere. I mean, that's just the way that it works. But yes, we were supported by the church. And a lot of that came from where we were received. The priest who received us and confirmed us had grown up Episcopalian himself. And he really, really understood where we were coming from, and he was very deferential to my experience, to what I had done in my own ministry. And going to his church and hearing him preach these wonderful homilies every week, and getting to know this community, as well as another Catholic community that was a little closer to our house, was all very positive.
Well, also, you were coming into a church that's been a lot under fire the last 20 years. Did that have an effect on your decision to enter?
It didn't really. It didn't really worry me that the Catholic Church had been going through so many difficulties, and that may be because of what the Lord finally showed me about what the church was. And it's that my journey all of these years wasn't towards the biggest and best denomination. It was towards the fullness of the faith. It was towards the church. And a conversation that I had with a priest during this run-up, right before we were received into the church, really helped me see this clearly. He said to me, the Catholic Church can be perfectly awful, but it's the real deal. And I thought to myself, that's right, the real deal. And then the more that I dug into the church's teachings, read the catechism, read the writings of Cardinal Ratzinger, Pope Benedict, the more that I understood that the emphasis that the church places is not on being this big denomination that sort of teaches these things that you ought to know about. And Cardinal Ratzinger said this over and over again, the church teaches reality. Reality. And I really became just captivated by that idea that, all these scandals aside, the church is still where reality is found.
That's almost an exact quote, if you will, from Irenaeus in Against Heresies, when he's fighting against all these Gnostics and all these false churches. He says, this is the real church.
Right.
The real church with the rule of faith.
That's right.
And the scriptures, and the witness. So it's he uses that word, the real church. We mentioned before the break this idea that you sensed a call to missionary as you come in. And of course, like I said, we're in a country that doesn't need missionaries anymore. We're totally a converted country. So how do you respond to that?
Well, we do need missionaries like never before. And the question is, what kind? What are we to do? What are we simply supposed to just kind of, change the way we think, or change the way we talk, or change our clothes, or something like that, kind of look less ridiculous? I don't think that's it. I'm not sure exactly, but I don't think that's quite it. But I do know that the organization that I work for now, Word on Fire, and Bishop Barron's ministry, has been really on taking the lead for a long time on this question of evangelization and thinking of ourselves as missionaries. So a big part of what I do now is engage with the offerings that the culture gives, films, TV shows, pieces of music, books, whatever they may be, other things going on in the culture, and take a kind of multifaceted approach. On the one hand, we want to identify in those things potential kinds of, that kind of proto-evangelion, just like things that could, it's not Christianity, it's not Catholicism, but there's something there that connects to the faith. And we want to point to those things and identify them and puff them up and bring them into the light. We also want to identify the things that are dangerous. We don't just want to consume media and say, well, this is the world we live in, right? We want to be able to draw a distinction to say, not only to be just kind of like moralists about things like, oh, there's a lot of bad words in that movie or something like that, but to say, what is this film or this TV show actually saying about the nature of the human person or about the nature of reality or existence? The church says something different from that, and we think it's better. So we want to kind of create that contrast, But I think more importantly than anything is we need to be with people. We need to figure out ways to build those bridges. And I continue to come back to Pope Benedict, but I really do think that he was somebody who, in his writings, knew this extremely well. Yeah. In his introduction to Christianity, he talks about how the Christian is sort of always walking this tightrope over nothingness. And sadly, some Christians, some Catholics fall in there. But he says if we posit that, then the inverse is also true, that non-religious people, atheists, people who are just sort of going along with the flow are also potentially dangerously close to that precipice where they could fall into reality too. And so we want to be there to kind of like help nudge them in. We want to like identify those things that are a way into that reality, to this experience of the world that is way better than just the easy stuff that the culture offers.
This challenge to evaluate a movie or a book or a television series on what can we winnow out and focus on what's helpful, and then what is the stuff that, we can't winnow that out. That's a really strong part of that.
Right.
But also, are there subtle ways that this medium is pulling us in a direction we don't realize, right?
Yeah.
And one thing that I haven't heard enough talk about, but I think is worth mentioning, is that even the best fiction, the best movies, seemingly fine movies, seemingly fine television programs, can have a subtle an impact over a long period of time, because many of them portray life without any vertical element at all. It may not be anti-God, it may be totally moral, but yet the whole thing portrays a world without any thought of the vertical.
Right.
And we become so accustomed to that I often think that's one of the biggest foundation stones to where we're at today, because we become so accustomed to hearing about life through books and media without any reference to a vertical element.
Right.
Or a purpose in life.
Right. Right. I think that this is right on, that we want to always be sort of challenging the culture to say, if you call something beautiful, where does that come from?
Yeah.
You always want to push that up to the vertical, right? Or if there's something true in this, or just, or like, figure out whatever the word is that is most valuable, to say, where does that come from? Where does that idea itself come from? Well, it comes from God. And we know a lot about God, and we want to talk to you about God. And it's not in this sort of crass, let me stick a tract in your hand kind of way. It's a real engagement. And it's something that, because of the degree of brokenness that we find ourselves in now, may take a very long time to fix. But we give thanks for those who continue to kind of fall into reality, and hope to make them evangelists too.
Conspiracy theories. When you evaluate Hollywood, books, publishers, media, newspapers, is there a concerted effort to pass along this undercutting idea to the Christian culture?
It's hard to say as far as what human intentions are, but it is very important to never forget that there is a war in the heavens, and that we're dealing with real spiritual warfare all the time, especially those of us who are doing evangelization, those of us who are ministering, who are seeking to be heralds of the gospel. And I think that it's so easy to forget, because the water that we swim in is kind of so detached from that we're led to believe that what's real is just what's right here, But Christians know that what's real is so much more than what's here. And that's why being a sacramental person, being a Catholic, being somebody who receives the Lord and receives grace through these appointed means, that's somebody who I think can be much more in touch, if that is a genuine person of belief, can be much more in touch with these sort of spiritual forces that are at work.
Sometimes in our work, when we're trying to help clergymen on the journey, and he or she's trying to discern whether God's calling them to become Catholic. Sometimes the answer that we've heard people give is, well, this person, he just needs to follow his conscience. Just needs to follow his conscience. Well, there's a truth in that, of course, but there's something about a formed conscience. But when I look at the media, when I look at the culture we're in, especially the woke folk, so many of them seem like they have no conscience. Is it just unformed? Is it been has it been totally stifled? And how much of your work is about forming consciences of people?
I think an important thing to note about kind of the cultural moment that we're in is that we're dealing with religious people, actually, right? Mm-hmm. So just instead of Christ and his church, we're dealing with a kind of an alternative religion. Mm-hmm. And I think as long as we're thinking along those lines, it's much easier to remember that we're dealing with even people who are pulling down statues or whatever it may be, that these are people who could still be susceptible to falling into the reality of Christ and his church. Yeah. And the question, it's so difficult these days to figure out how to build those bridges, but I find some solace in just understanding that somebody who is so passionate about something that they would do things that are so scandalous. People don't do those things if they don't believe or if they don't want to believe. And the truth is that's just always been the case. I mean, human beings are naturally religious. And this is how the Catechism even begins, right? It is the nature of human beings to desire God with our hearts.
Take an email from Father Timothy. I think it reads it. I'm an Episcopalian priest who has been long drawn towards Rome. I worry, though, about leaving behind my ministry and also my witness to orthodoxy in the Episcopal Church. Thoughts or advice?
I would have a couple of thoughts. I would certainly encourage Timothy to reach out to me, to others who have made that journey more directly. You know, I think that the question of what about his people is a really important one. It's certainly something that I struggled with. The way that I've sort of come to deal with this is in a couple of different ways. For one thing, a few of my former parishioners have come into the Catholic Church, and not because of me. Maybe because of me, but I moved out of town. I mean, it wasn't me who said to them, hey, let's take this journey together. But because of what I did, they thought, I need to explore that too. Yeah. The other thing is whether you stay or go, I sometimes think that question, and I don't want to imply this about Timothy, I just want to imply this about myself, is that when I asked myself that question, I knew it was me thinking too highly of my own influence. That what's going to happen to these people if I go? Will it kind of shatter their faith? Like I'm trying to teach them the truth as well as I can within this extra Catholic framework. I would say here you just really need to think of the selflessness, actually, of coming into the church.
It would seem to me what you said there is exactly right, in the sense that if you're in that position and you're trying to decide whether should I stay or should I go, as the song goes, is to examine that very issue. What is the reasons that I'm thinking I should stay? And so that should be a question. And you may decide with prayer and through spiritual direction that, no, that's not the reason, that the timing issue is such that it just seems right that God wants me here to offer up my separation for the good of these people. That may be the timing issue. That's why in our work, we recognize that God's timing may be the issue, especially if you got a spouse that wants nothing to do with the journey.
Yes. Well, I'll tell you, in 2015, I felt like I was at a crisis point, and maybe that was the time to come. And I remember having a conversation with a Catholic priest who had been an Episcopal priest, and he said to me over the phone, look, convert today, right now. Doesn't matter what the cost is, doesn't matter, just do it right now. And I was so freaked out by that phone call that it delayed our conversion. Yeah. I mean, it didn't delay because it's all God's timing, But I have learned in my conversations with people that, like when push comes to shove, I would say, go sooner rather than later, and the Lord will provide, But at the same time, you do have to take into consideration that there are people who may be a little bit further back on the journey who need a little more time.
Well, and the vow that you make to your wife is a vow above all others.
Yes.
Because you're one with her. So that's an important decision in this process. It's also interesting to recognize that the Catholic Church has established the ordinariate. Well, what's the assumption of the ordinariate? That an Anglican priest is bringing with him a bunch of folk.
That's right.
That's the assumption. Well, that implies that after that Anglican priest came to the convictions, he was around long enough to bring some.
That's right.
So that implies the possibility of a timing issue.
That's right.
So that's why it's a matter, it's not just black and white. It's a matter of discernment.
That's right.
But also you're emphasizing that the reasons of holding back have got to be good too. They got to be right.
They do.
Yeah,
They do. And I think, I know guys who, and I'm not meaning to impugn them or anything like that, but I know guys who are a lot further along in their career as Episcopal priests or Anglican clergy, and they're saying, look, if I leave now, like if I stick around another 10 or 12 years, I'm going to get that pension, and I understand that. I understand that to some degree, but honestly, that issue became for me a source of idolatry. Yeah. It became for me, if I'm sticking around for money at the end of my life, no way. It's kind of like in the movie When Harry Met Sally. Harry says to Sally, when you decide you want to spend the rest of your life with someone, you want the rest of your life to start as soon as possible. And at some point, that's where you got to live.
Yeah. So there's both examining the reasons that I'm hesitant to go, but also examining what are the reasons to go forward.
That's right.
What are the reasons that I'm thinking of becoming Catholic? Make sure they're right. Make sure they're good and beautiful and true. All right. We've got another email. Frank from New Orleans. Does Andrew think that his background as an Episcopalian prepared him to appreciate the Catholic Church? What are some similarities between an Episcopal faith and the Catholic Church? And how does he see Catholicism as the completion of what he believed before?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And again, it goes to the official ecumenical stance of the Catholic Church, that what I was not nothing. Yeah. That I was in a room that was very near the front door, as it were, to the church. And so, I've heard you before, Marcus, use the analogy of becoming Catholic is kind of like becoming a Frenchman. And, I love that analogy because I happen to speak French. So for me, it's like becoming a Frenchman is a little bit easier in some respects than it would be for somebody who's never learned a word of French, right? And it's sort of like that, I think. Yeah. For me coming from the Episcopal Church. Of course, there's a lot of similarities, and but there are a lot of differences. And I think that this can end up being kind of a shock to people, that you need to know that you're not just there are going to be big changes. I don't know what more to say about that. Yeah.
Right. And some of it involves looking back and saying, guys, some of the stuff I said was wrong.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying?
For sure.
It's tough.
Absolutely.
You might have to say, those 10 books I wrote back then, well, if I rewrote them.
That's right.
I mean, Newman had to do a little bit of that himself.
Indeed, yeah. Yeah.
Let's address that very issue, because let's say watching you right now is a man like that priest that's on the journey, or maybe it's an Episcopalian or an Anglican that had no intention of watching this show, but was flipping through, and then there you are. What would you like to say to him or her about why they should consider making the same journey you've made?
Well, let me come back to C.S. Lewis, one of my heroes. Reading the Chronicles of Narnia, you come to the very end, and at the end of the last battle, when they go through the door, Lewis says that all of their adventures in Narnia and their whole life on Earth up to this point had been just the title page and the introduction. And walking through the door was the start of chapter 1 of the story that goes on forever. And, I think that is one way to think about where those guys are, where I was. That you're at the beginning of something that could have a richness that you cannot even imagine. And this is, I can say this just personally, experiencing this fullness of communion, the riches of all the gifts that I now get to sort of plunder from the treasure chest of the Catholic Church is as good as advertised or better. And all the good things that I had as an Episcopalian are magnified so many times over now in the Catholic Church. And I'm not just talking about the worship experience or something like that. It's that depth. What I was experiencing in worship, what I was teaching to my people, studying the Bible, all of these things are so much richer when you're in the church. And it really is one of those things where you have to sort of get in it in order to really see what it is. And so I know that's a little bit of a cop-out for some of our friends who might be thinking about converting, but I can only say from my own experience, it's true.
So watching Bishop Barron's Catholicism helps?
It does help. I'll tell you, for no other reason, it's somebody who is entirely Christocentric. It's somebody who is unwaveringly Catholic, but also is clearly aware of all of these different interlocutors, right, who might be trying to engage with that. So yeah, watching Catholicism is a great thing to do.
Andrew, thank you so much.
Thank you, Marcus.
Thank you for joining us on the program, and God bless you in all your work. And excited to hear more about the work that you'll be doing with Word of Fire. And thank you for joining us on this episode of The Journey Home. I do pray that Andrew's journey is an encouragement to you. God bless you. See you next week.